on the line. We've got 5 smiling faces, which is awesome. Liam has had a drink and it's like a half time. You should have an orange just like half time of any sport, Liam, just to get yourself back on.
Oh, I'm running out of steam already. So.
Oh no, we're all good. Look, I'd like to welcome everyone to the second session for the in this morning's conference proceedings, which is basically a summary of some of the lead-in sessions that we did previously. I'm Steve O'Malley. I'm a GADPOD associate. I'm a diversity and inclusion firefighter at Fire Rescue Victoria, and proudly have been associated with the Gender and Disaster pod and Deb and Claire's research right back to 2012. So early days, and I got hooked well and truly early. Look, I want to introduce our speakers, but before that, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we meet on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge traditional custodians of on which the speakers here in the panel and maybe people who are out there listening, on which you are as well. Pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and really Victor, he can't join us here online, but Victor is quite, well, very important in the scheme of things. This is our First Nations presenter and one of the most important lead-in sessions, and something that I certainly was thrilled to be able to facilitate that conversation with Victor. We'll show a little bit of that presentation soon. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce some of our panelists, or all of our panelists here, but some of the speakers of our really important and well-attended lead-in sessions. And I must say that, and I'll finish by saying this as well, but those lead-in sessions that the presenters here today facilitated prior to the conference proper are still available online. So you can go back, and this basically is a bit of a fill-up to encourage you to go back to look at those sessions as they were presented early on. Associate Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer. Hi, Susan. I saw you drop in on the last presentation just quickly, but I'll shorten the introductions so we can get to the content. Victor Steffensen can't be here, as I said, but we'll be showing a video of Victor. Leonard and Naomi Bailey are both GADPOD associates and friends of mine, so they won't mind a shortened introduction at all. And you'll get to hear more from Naomi and Liam as we go through the course of the conference. And particularly excited to speak to Karleen Gribble from Western Sydney University, Associate Professor as well, Karleen. And Karleen's going to speak particularly about to do with women and children, which wasn't really part of the focus of the original GADPOD research back in the day, but is an important addition to the guidelines and the checklists from which we operate in the now revised versions of that gender and emergency management guidelines. First off, Susan.
Hi, everybody. It's delightful to be here. Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Turrbal and Jagera country in Brisbane in Queensland, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and anybody who's joining us from the First Nations today. So look, I'm here to give you a really big picture introduction. In my lead-in, I went from global statistics about gender and climate change to my own personal example of my hometown of Coonabarabran in New South Wales, experiencing very serious bushfires twice recently, and proposing the idea, which I've written further in Griffith Review, about whether they are the first climate refugees in Australia, whether the people from Coonabarabran who left and never came back might be the first forcibly displaced by climate emergencies after the large fires there a few years ago. And then I conclude in my lead-in statement about insurance, and I think I might just set you a bit of a scene and talk to you about how we need some good gender analysis so that climate justice issues that don't leap to our eye as gendered issues, but in fact have serious gender implications. They're the kinds of things we have to keep our eyes on. We have to think about that right now so that we can plan for a future in which climate impacts are already starting. So I do research within the Griffith University Climate Action Beacon. We have a 5-year program on climate action, and I'm the leader of the climate justice theme. So I'm interested in climate justice, which is a kind of work that was pioneered by Mary Robinson, the human rights leader in many things, the former Irish president. And we talk about the idea that climate adaptation and mitigation must be fair and must leave no vulnerable people or communities behind. And that when we're thinking about how we will adjust to climate change, then human rights protections must be a part of that. And of course, within that, gender equality is extremely important. So this sort of research ranges from who are the women involved in climate negotiations, who are the women in the IPCC panel and how few there are, who are the voices in this debate, who's being listened to and who's at the table. So just a few of the kind of essential kinds of questions that we think about are the data pictures we know around the globe that we already knew that women and children are significant, more likely than men to die during climate-related disasters. I first started following this as my former life as an aid worker around the Indian Ocean tsunami. Killed more women than anybody else, and there was lots of reasons for that, including lack of information, where they were often in homes rather than out on the streets, but also stayed in place when they should have ran. Also, we know that women are poorer generally around the world than men, and often reliant on environmental resources as their primary source of food and income. So this access to resources, education, information, land and credit, they're very important issues to consider when we think about how people respond to emergencies. We also know, we've seen it with COVID, that emergencies exacerbate existing inequalities, particularly around gender-based violence, but also exploitation. So now in my last couple of minutes, I just want you to think about issues around insurance. So you might think to yourself, okay, what on earth does insurance have to do with all of this? But we know that the frequency and impact of climate disasters are creating an insurance crisis in this country, and the Australian government has just made an announcement in the last couple of days about flood insurance in North Queensland, that they will be a government guarantor from now on because of the insurance companies simply won't bear the risk. And so one of the climate justice questions that I'm interested in is what becomes of uninsurable people, professions, places. So there's an emerging class of people who will unable to be insured their homes, their personal or household effects from the effects of disasters and even health insurance, including bushfires, coastal inundation, rivering, flooding, extreme winds, soil subsidence caused by drought and so forth. And I am arguing this is a gender justice issue because as Australian women are poorer than men in later life, I think this is going to get worse and worse and will create precarity around housing and livelihoods for women in their later life. So I'm basing this on the recent ABS data that by the time they're 60, 34% of single women in Australia live in poverty. So the face of homelessness we know in Australia is now single women over 60. And we know that the single women over 60 have the worst statistics in terms of income, less than $30,000 a year. So that means any increase in insurance is going to make that cohort of people live a more precarious and difficult life. And so what we're talking about now, or thinking about, is these once in a lifetime, once in 100-year events, certainly not becoming once in 100-year events, and what that means for what we call red zone postcodes, where government-backed insurance programs do not yet exist. So what this means is that we have to get women much more interested in, or much more involved in these insurance conversations, but also in disaster prevention and mitigation issues. And it also means that we have to be aware that many major disasters are going to have forced mobility issues for older women in particular. So I want to put that on the table as a gender justice issue. I've come to the end of my time and we have a short thing, but you can see my whole video, which talks a lot more about the Coonabarabran bushfires, the global statistics, and bringing it home to what I think is a future gender justice issue in Australia. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. That's wonderful. And yes, please speakers, remind everyone that they can go back and look at your lead-in presentations for sure. The notion of gender justice, just for survival. I mean, that's what we need to get our head around. And it's a wonderful sentiment and great presentation, Susan. So I watched again this morning just to remind myself of it. So thanks again. I'm sure some questions will pop up. What I'd like to do now is go to a video a snippet from Victor's lead-in session. So Victor Steffensen is an Indigenous writer and filmmaker, and a wonderful man, a musician, a consultant applying traditional knowledge in contemporary context. What Victor will speak about a little bit about now is some of the issues or some of the challenges he has when he talks about his traditional land management, particularly coal burning, to the bureaucracies when he has to deal with councils and the like. So we'll go to that video if we can, please.
Like I was talking to councils today, and they out on country, you know, and just about everyone, I get them out on country. That's the classroom, and that's where we involve the landscape and the land talk. I mean, it's not me talking out there; it's me interpreting.
Yeah.
And when I'm interpreting, and you know, I'm basically, you know, reading the signs of the landscape, and so that people can see what the land's saying and what's happening. And when they see those indicators, and then they see the behavior of the fire, and where they see where it stops, and you know, everything that we say the fire does, and it just, you know, you can't get any more proof than that, than the landscape itself. And when we look at all the meetings that are had with agencies, governments, councils, whatever, you know, you get nowhere when we sit in a meeting room. And you know, over all the years, you know, growing up and seeing, and you know, all the years of trying to get this fire through and banging your head against the wall at meetings, and you know, I've done all that before too, you know, and you realize that there's one vital person missing, you know, or well, person or being missing, and that is the country. And that being is the country. It's a living thing, and it's never heard. And people's got their own decisions and their own perceptions, but when the country steps in, then you can't argue with that. And that's why it's really crucial that I take them out on the land and interpret the land to them and show them in their own backyard what's going on. And when they actually get that, they understand. And so when I've finished talking, they're all quiet, and you can hear their mind going, you know, and they're thinking, and what they're actually thinking about is, yeah, they're thinking about the knowledge and trying to make sense of what was just said to them. But not only that, they're actually thinking about themselves as well. They're thinking like, oh, you know, we should be doing this, and we should be doing that, and we should be helping these people, and we should actually we should have been doing these programs a long time ago. And so that's what's going on in their heads. And within one day, the council were on board to look at ways of funding the rangers and trying to get fire practitioners in the regions, and within a couple of hours being on country, and it's just go home all excited. And that always happens. And you know, but the challenge is trying to keep that going, where people are so excited and they get home, and then they fall over, and it's like, oh, they wake up next day and they might have forgotten about it all again.
Yeah.
Or they get to work and they go, oh, we should be doing this, doing that, and then there's someone on a higher rank that goes, oh no, we're not doing that. And then we have a paramilitary structures within all these agencies as well, and governments that they're just set up in a way that ain't gonna get any common sense through in some sense, because you got so many people in charge. And that really is probably the hardest thing to bowl over, is that paramilitary structure that sits within the agencies. Because you'll win over everyone else, but it just takes one person to say no from a higher level, and then it doesn't go ahead. And 100% of the time, the reasons have nothing to do with the landscape.
I think, Karen, there's been some news in the not so distant past where organisations haven't listened to the landscape, and in actual fact they've savaged the landscape without any consultation, without any knowledge whatsoever. So how they don't listen to someone who has put their life into his craft in fire management and land management, and he so casually carries the can for a culture, the First Nations culture, for tens of thousands of years, and he just does it like, well, he does it like falling off a log, dare I say it, and he is so in tune and in touch with the country. As I said, a wonderful human being and a great presentation. Well, half of the presenters on that presentation were wonderful. So I implore you that Victor can't but go back and have a look at his leading session too, because it really is wonderful. Next up, we've got Leonard. And once again, a quick introduction early on, Liam, but as a GADPOD associate and someone I train with and whose friendship I value, I'd like to hear more from you as well about your leading session, Liam.
All right. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm going to work to notes just because I've done the lead-in session and my brain's a little bit all over the place. I won't be referring actually to the session that I did initially. I want to refer to a question that somebody asked after our session, which was, what were the links between LGBTQA+ people and women? What was the framework that allowed us to talk about both of those? So you'll hear throughout the conference lots of evidence showing that under disaster conditions, existing inequalities are magnified, including gender inequalities, leading to increased risk for women of a whole range of behaviours. It's true also for LGBTQA+ people that under disaster conditions, there's a ratcheting up of existing inequalities, and LGBTQA+ people are then subject to a whole range of added pressures and problems arising from disaster. So what I want to do is I want to group some of the issues facing LGBTQA+, that's lesbians, gay men, bisexual, trans and gender diverse people, and queer people, under two headings, and I'm only going to talk about the first, I'm afraid. I can see I won't have time. So I want to ask, what are the benefits of expanding a gender focus to include sexuality in all aspects of disaster planning and service delivery? That is, what are the benefits of linking some of the issues that women face to some of the issues that LGBTQA+ people, because that is in part the work that Deb and I, or I've been doing with Deb at the GADPOD, is taking the gender focus of the GADPOD, making sure that's not backgrounded, but starting to consider how an expanded framework that looks at the intersections of gender and sexuality can also accommodate some of the issues facing LGBTQA+ people. So what I thought I called what I'm going to talk about the interactions and intersections of gender and sexuality. And I start with this. In the absence of the godlike presence of PowerPoint slides, I'd like you all to conjure up images of the public face of the response to disaster. And I apologise in advance for the images that might come to mind. For me, I see images of our male heads of state dressed in army fatigues in front of imposing military hardware, or in emergency vests and hats, addressing our military and emergency personnel before they are shipped off to their next call of duty. These are our male leaders demonstrating what I'm going to call heroic or hypermasculinity. These are real men demonstrating that facing and overcoming disasters relies on ramping up, or perhaps pumping up, those everyday masculine traits that they value: strength, resolve, control, technical know-how and mastery. I call this demonstration of hypermasculinity by our political leaders disaster drag. When the cameras stop rolling, Johnny Howard or Scotty Morrison take off their disaster drag and settle back into their suits and ties. Their public demonstration of male heroics is purely performative. It's a form of public spectacle in which they draw on as they contribute to the ongoing valorisation of traditional masculinity on which their authority as leaders and leaders in times of crises necessarily depend. What is not apparent, I think, is that disaster drag is not only the public demonstration of our male leaders' gender, it is also the public performance of their sexuality. A real hero, a real leader, is not only masculine but heterosexual. These are men doing it for their wives, their mothers, their children. Their heroics are in the service of the vulnerable, the dependent, all those who are coded feminine within a heteronormative tale of male service to family and country. In the Australian context, the presence of women in these stage performances is rare and unsettling. It questions the gendered assumptions that overcoming disaster is an exclusively male prerogative. It's, however, I would suggest, even harder to imagine the presence of an out gay man, an effeminate man, a trans man in these public performances of hypermasculinity. Just as the presence of women in these public images unsettles the gender divisions between male and female disaster appropriate behaviours, the presence of gender diverse or gay men unsettles the assumed heterosexuality of our male leaders. What I'm suggesting is that heroic or hypermasculinity reveals the ways in which gender and sexuality are each dependent on the other. Focusing on gender alone ignores the ways in which male heroics is also a demonstration of heterosexuality. It also masks the ways in which male violence against women and the increasing violence against women under disaster conditions can be thought of as a consequence of the gendered construction of heterosexuality. That is, men demonstrating in the sexual sphere their prowess, their aggressiveness, and under disaster conditions that can be used to legitimate increased violence against women by these men saying there is increasing pressure on our role as men. I suggest renaming family violence against women as heterogendered violence rather than as gendered violence. So doing names men's violence as an expression of the intersection of gender and sexuality in the constitution of male privilege. It also brings into view other forms of family and domestic violence that are backgrounded or masked if we focus only on gender. This includes violence in same-sex and gender-diverse relationships and family violence against LGBTQA+ people by other family members. Now, according to the Irish academic Fionnuala Newlin, hypermasculinity is a form of masculinity, she says, in which the strictures against femininity and homosexuality are especially intense. Real heroes cannot behave like women, they cannot display feminine-like behaviours. At the same time, real heroes cannot be gay, they cannot demonstrate attraction towards people of the same sex. So the prohibition against femininity and the prohibition against being gay are not separate. Each depends on and reinforces the other in the valorisation of hypermasculinity and male heroics. Now, we saw this played out in the growing list of male leaders who, during the response to the first wave of COVID-19, were at pains to reject or challenge non-heroic measures aimed at reducing the spread of the virus. Brazil's President Bolsonaro made explicit the mutually reinforcing sexist and homophobic dynamics at play behind many male leaders' performance of their heroic masculinity when he chided his presidential staff who were wearing masks, saying, "Masks are for fairies." We see the intersection of prohibitions against feminine behaviour and homosexuality in Deb and Alyssa Duncan's interviews with lesbian and bisexual women who worked as emergency service staff and volunteers. As one of the women in the study observed of male firefighters, if you're gay, you're somehow not manly. And the thing of a fireman being the archetype of masculinity, like the men who have gone, I put on a fire helmet, so that makes me a man. Then if they see a gay man wearing the helmet, it's like, well, what does that make me? So what I'm suggesting, and this is where I'll close, is I'm suggesting that in the work we're doing and in the conference, broadening a gender lens to include sexuality and gender diversity shows that some of the initiatives that target women benefit LGBTQA+ people, because some of the constructions of hypermasculinity actually have effects on both populations. And it starts to trace out possible joint efforts between feminist work and LGBTQA+ advocacy in this space. And it also begins to unpick some of the heroic and hypermasculine myths that dominate emergency services and, I would suggest, our leaders' performances. But it deconstructs it in ways that say it's not simply about gender, it's about the intersections of gender and sexuality and the necessary exclusion of both women and LGBTQA+ people from that space of leadership and hypermasculinity. That's me, Steve.
Thanks, Liam. And as Liam said then, we, throughout the course of our lessons in disaster training, we ask people to broaden their concepts and the schema they have regarding gender to consider those LGBTIQA+ communities as well. Karleen Gribble, Associate Professor Karleen Gribble from Western Sydney University. I'll forgo the long intro again, Karleen, and you can get straight into your leading session, please. Unmute, Karleen, sorry. Thank you. Oh, you double clicked.
Sorry, it's very helpful if you're unmuted when you're supposed to be speaking. But thank you very much. Like Liam, I'm wanting to talk about something slightly different from my lead-in session, which really went into a little bit of detail, at least, on the proposed new section in the GEM guidelines on pregnant and breastfeeding women and those caring for infants and young children. But I thought I'd just give a little bit of a background there. I was interested to hear from Susan that she had been working in the response to the Indian Ocean tsunami. And in fact, that was what brought me into the area of infant and young child feeding in emergencies. Because as we saw with that, catastrophic emergency that affected, resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands of people, women and those caring for young children and children themselves were disproportionately affected by that emergency. And that's the case in all emergencies, because if you're a mother, if you're a pregnant woman, it's much more difficult to actually leave, to escape the emergency. And then in the aftermath, those caregiving responsibilities significantly impact upon your ability to access resources and to look after yourself, really, and those for whom you're responsible. So I'm a member of a group called the Infant and Young Child Feeding in Emergencies Core Group, which internationally has developed guidance for organisations, NGOs and governments so that they actually develop good planning and guidance to ensure that the emergency responses to those who are caring for infants and young children is that it's done well. I've been working mostly internationally, but lately have turned my attention to Australia. And what we have here in some research that I did showed that we don't really have planning for children generally in our emergency management planning, and specifically regarding pregnancy and the needs of those caring for infants around feeding, breastfeeding and formula feeding. They're just absent from our guidance and from our planning. And as a result of that, we have all sorts of problems when an emergency occurs. And we heard in the first session this morning about some challenges around the COVID-19 emergency, around caring for infants, from formula feeding and breastfeeding. And that has continued through COVID. It was through the Black summer of bushfires, was again another issue. So we're in this position where we don't have the planning, and this addition into the GEM guidelines will hopefully help to get that further along the way. One of the things that some organisations have done in order to try and get more attention to this is actually developed a call for action, asking the federal government to take some steps towards actually developing some planning. Because although we have this high-level international guidance, which has been endorsed by the World Health Organization, and that Australia as a member of the World Health Assembly has a responsibility to endorse, it needs to be adapted for our situation here in Australia. And we need some resources to make that happen, and we need people to be brought together to make that happen. So this call for action's been signed by about 40 emergency health, women's and children's organisations, asking the government to actually just convene a group to start talking. So if you're from an organisation that's involved in any of those areas and you would like to sign on to this as well, you're very welcome to contact me, and I can arrange that. Because this is something, how can we be in a position where we know that that infants and young children and children generally are vulnerable, and we don't have planning to meet their needs? And where it fits in there here with gender is, of course, that it is women who are pregnant and who give birth and who are responsible for the care of infants. It's linked to their physiology. It's not just a gendered kind of role there. There is actually a physical and a physiological link. But then we have the continuing gendered role of caring for older children as well. So we know that this is really affecting women the most. So we really need to do something about it.
Thanks, Karleen. That's incredible. I'm so looking forward to learning more about your work as you develop it and embed it into the latest iteration of the GEM guidelines. So yes, and I implore people to look at your previous presentation and also to contact you as you've just offered. So thanks so much, Karleen. Our next speaker is another associate of the GAD pod and a dear friend of mine, Naomi Bailey. Naomi, a little introduction of yourself is a lead into talking about your leading session, which was to do with reporting and journalism around emergencies.
Hi, thanks, Steve, and thanks to all of the presenters who've preceded me. What a rich tapestry of things that we all need to go and download and listen to and look at. I come from a public health background, so I've worked for a long time in the prevention of violence against women and with the GAD-POD since 2014. I think that's important to mention because it really frames how I understand the issues. And I, in another life, work for Watch, the National Prevention Agency funded under the National Plan for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And I just wanted to briefly mention the frameworks that they use to shape this work, which are publicly available. So the national framework, Change the Story, identifies the drivers of violence against women. And using a public health model, it gives us a sense of what we can do to prevent violence, what we can do at the stage of early intervention, and what we can do at the response phase. There's a certain sort of simpatico, I think, with those stages and how we think about how we prevent disasters and emergencies, what we do at the point of early intervention and how we respond. Changing the Picture, which is the framework that looks at colonial patriarchy and violence against First Nations women and how we prevent that. I know we're doing an interview later in the conference with Carla McGrady, who wrote that paper, which I think will be really interesting. And then Men in Focus is the third framework, which really asks the question about gender and violence by bringing men into the centre of the frame. Of course, Deb and Claire's work comes out of this same prevention history that precedes the establishment of Our Watch, and so thinks about these questions in a similar fashion. But to drill down a little, our lead-in session on media reporting about violence against women, I think, our lead-in session on reporting on emergencies and thinking about that from a gendered point of view, I think really digs into some of these core ideas about prevention, early intervention and response. So what can we do when it comes to storytelling, myth-making and stereotypes? I think they're all really relevant to our collective approach to understanding emergencies and disasters, but also critical to our understanding around how emergencies and disasters are reported in contemporary media. So Rebecca and Stephanie did an extraordinary job of giving us some insight into what it's like to go out and report on emergencies and disasters and how, for them, they see that through a gendered lens. And what I see when I look at the program for the Gender Justice Conference is that that sort of storytelling, myth-making and engagement with stereotypes is happening in all sorts of different places. So we've got our researchers who are creating a body of evidence from which we can interrogate some of the myths and stereotypes, but also some of the ways of telling when it comes to reporting on disasters, but also when it comes to understanding what's happening in front of our eyes. We've also got panels which I understand to be, you know, the stories we tell through design when it comes to emergencies, but also lots of those quiet places in which not enough stories are being told. And so a question that comes up for me when I look at the program is, how do we listen? How do we do deep listening and hear the stories that perhaps aren't or haven't yet been told? And here I include the stories of survivors and communities as experts on their experience. And so I think for me, one of the things that I'm really excited about and which came across really strongly in the session, in the lead-in session that we did, was sort of in the form of a question, which is something like, what happens when we acknowledge that gender discrimination in the industry, that gendered storytelling, relying on gendered stereotypes, is something that we are always already operating within when it comes to reporting on disasters and emergencies. These things are already present. Yeah, we're not looking for necessarily new information. We are just perhaps deep listening to some spaces that are there, things that aren't being said, stories that aren't being told, or that live in the margins or the relief. And perhaps that kind of question opens another space where many complex, rich, diverse, untold, poorly told, badly documented, erroneously represented stories are. And I know that we're all interested in these stories, that's why we're here. But I think the lead-in session that Rebecca and Steph really, where Rebecca and Steph really just sort of opened these questions up, I think it gave us both great conceptual tools for seeing and hearing these stories and really practical tips for how to do this reporting. So I'd encourage you to listen to it. I'd encourage you to send it to your local media producers, but I'd also encourage you to think about using it to become a new voice in this space if you are regularly experiencing in the way of seeing this in your community. We know with the increasingly quick but historically slow-moving disaster of climate change that we've all been seeing this for generations now. That's really all that I wanted to say, Steve. Thanks.
That's heaps. And if I could, we've got a little bit of time for questions. And Susan's such a team player. You answered your questions live, Susan, but is there anything else you'd like to contribute to what you've said in that live chat? And hopefully all the delegates or attendees can see that.
Sure. Well, I just want us to think about crises and emergencies as a time of possible gender regression or retrenchment. So exactly what Liam is saying, there are a time of certain types of performances, but there's also a great attraction in utilitarian thinking in a crisis, greatest good for the greatest number. So what you often see, or most characteristically, even though I've been to many lessons learned, humanitarian emergency people love lessons learned exercises, and yet we do not learn the lesson that vulnerable people, people with disabilities, people who are marginalised in any way, get overlooked, and also that the gaze shifts too fast. So the gaze of the governing body just shifts away from that community after the first phase, and then they're left on their own and abandoned. So that kind of discipline of crisis, we call it, it's often not a good time for human rights. So I think we should expect that. We should say, okay, there is an emergency, there is a crisis. We're going to see some retrogression around gender norms. We're going to see some utilitarian thinking that ignores the most vulnerable. Think about COVID, you know, we just let people in aged care and prisons and people in domestic violence situations. That was eminently foreseeable, you know, that household lockdowns would lead to some of those issues. So if we're aware of that, we've got to be better at planning. So I'm hoping that we all are much more alert and alarmed by that kind of proposition in the future. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a question here that sort of is directed towards the responders, and I think I've just lost it, unless it was answered. It was for Liam. I'll try to see it again. Oh yeah, sorry. Is it reasonable to expect that diversity and visibility of diverse groups and disaster response personnel could improve the experiences of diverse people in communities, even if diverse staff, volunteers that is, or career staff in these organisations are not necessarily given a voice or any power to challenge exclusionary practices? It's a mouthful, but you get the gist.
I think I get the gist of the question. Yes, if you're an LGBTQA+ person and you're actually going to a disaster relief centre, visibly seeing someone who identifies with your community is helpful. So for instance, wearing a lanyard, wearing a badge. However, I think if that person, that worker is not supported by organisational systems processes, it can actually backfire. So for instance, if I'm someone who has a same-sex partner and we've been separated, he's been sent to a different emergency centre, and I go to a person who's marked and I see represents my community who has absolutely no power to do anything about that, those things can really unwind and escalate your feeling of exclusion. So yes, absolutely. it's important to have, if not out, LGBTQA plus people who identify with the community in that first response in emergency centres. But I would say that is still limited if those people then in those organisations don't have systemic support. Even simple things like being able to give someone, an LGBTQA plus person, local referral services for mental health or GP or support or family care, who you know are LGBTQA plus sensitive. So yes, but I do think there are limits to that. And I would never put the emphasis on staff in organisations who are not supported by organisational systems and processes. I think you risk the health and wellbeing of those staff as well. So I hope that captures some of the question.
It does. That goes to the gist of an answer, actually. There's three here directed towards you, Karleen, and they're shout outs to see how people can get involved, how they can sign up to lobby, for want of a better word, federal government. And Masculinity, who are always on the front foot in regards to this sort of subject matter, they're sharing a resource, and ADA, who are a valued partner of us throughout the running of this conference. So how can they actually sign up? I suppose another call out to you, Karleen.
Yeah, well, probably the best thing would be for them to email me. So I'm easy to find. If you email me, you can find my email address, and you know, flick me an email, and I can link you in. And I had a look at the Macedon Rangers guidance that they click to there, and yeah, like, that's fabulous. You've got to realise how rare that is. I mean, if people are interested in more, you know, information about where we are actually placed in Australia, I have got a paper published that was a review of all of Australia's national and state and territory guidance and planning, and a proportion of local government planning and guidance, just an audit to show just the bad position that we're in. But yeah, I'd really like to congratulate them from looking at what's there. What you've got there is actually, you know, really on the right path. So, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. I know they'll love hearing that. So, and they're always on the front foot. We've got a couple of minutes to go. Has anyone got a closing statement they'd like to make? Naomi, there's a couple of questions there. You were going to answer one online in regards to stereotypes in the media, but there's also the storytelling question, which is to do with, you know, social media, that, you know, that throws so many cats amongst pigeons, for want of a better metaphor, around what the actual story is.
Yeah, I'd really recommend, so I guess there are a couple of things here. I think one is there's national guidelines on reporting on violence against women, which we know increases during emergencies and disasters, and I'd encourage people to access those. There's also a tip sheet, and that's on the Our Watch Media homepage. Which just ensures that when people are covering violence against women, they don't reinforce some of those myths and stereotypes that we know drive violence in the first place. When it comes to whether or not there are still stereotypes in the media these days, I think if you think about media coverage of disasters, I just ask you to bring up the first image in your mind. For some people, that will be of somebody holding a hose. For others, it will be of an emergency, somebody clad in emergency management gear holding a hose. For some, as Liam pointed out, it will be leaders sort of performing a particular role and how that role conforms to ideas of masculinity. For others, it will be a more local version of that image, which might be, I have one seared on my mind, which is a man in his singlet and shorts and thongs standing on his roof in the middle of a bushfire with a hose, just a domestic hose. The problem with these kinds of images, the concerning things about these kinds of images, are that they do reinforce particular types of stereotypes that just aren't accurate. We know that women are very active in firefighting, but we also know that women are very active in protecting themselves, their families, children, and their community. And that heroic action, what would it be to rethink of leaving early as heroic action, right? So when we think about stereotypes, let's think into some of those gendered ways that we talk about heroes and that we talk about, you know, fighting like a girl or caregiving responsibilities or the way in which women tend to be forced back into the home at times of emergency and disaster. It's not as important that she has a job because she's doing okay, he's not doing okay, so we have to make sure that he's got this, that or the other. Not disputing that everybody needs great care during the response phase and the recovery phase. Everybody does need great care, but how do we think about those how do we think through a gendered lens and understand that some of that, the distribution of resources is really failing to meet need, basically. Just draw down on everything that everybody's already said to reinforce that idea. I think the social media thing, I'm not going to go on about it, but it's a great idea. How do we make sure that we're getting the right messages out on social media? I'd encourage people to look at things like the Vic Health Backlash Encountering Resistance resource, which can really give you some good ideas about how to frame the challenge. If you want to challenge these things on social media, we know that that can be a pretty wild and woolly and unsafe space. So also think about using the Gen Vic moderation guidelines, social media moderation guidelines with help, which can help with that. But we also know that social media can really amplify these important stories that aren't being told, and it's a direct access kind of piece. More work to be done in that space. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Naomi. So I'd like to thank each, and we're on time, each of the panelists, Liam, Naomi, Karleen and Susan. I'd like to end though on one of the questions posed to Victor in his absence, which says, and I'm going to reframe it like a statement because I've always wanted to do that, Q&A fan and all that sort of stuff. Victor says people need to understand issues personally and then you get change. But one person can derail it. Now, you spoke about that in the organisations that are generally speaking rank structured. And there's no funding. I mean, that came up in our conversation that we put a cry out for the fact that he works in the smell of an oily rag, basically. There's no funding. This issue is so widespread and it's pervasive and it makes his job so hard and it makes taking land management by our First Nations people seriously when they don't actually fund it properly. So the statement part of it is we must get back to what's important: land, women, men, LGBTIQA+, etc. Thank you so much for your input today, everyone. I implore everyone to go back to the sessions, the lead-in sessions. I also implore you to stay on for the rest of the conference. Have a look at the program online, the Gender Justice and Disaster Inspiring Action Conference, social media. Tell your friends, tell your family at dinner tonight, talk about the sessions that you tuned into today. I'm sure you will. Thanks everyone again, and it's just been fantastic to have this chat.